It's nice to sit outside on a sunny day. The sun's actually pretty damaging for your skin. That's why I use sunscreen. Sunscreen has pigments in it that protect your skin from the sun's rays. But if your skin gets too much sun, it'll actually make its own pigments to protect itself. Those pigments are called melanin and they're brown. That's why you tan. Now, humans aren't the only animals that can tan. Corals can tan too. And this cool paper is the first time that anyone has ever shown that corals can change color if they get too much sun. The scientists who published this cool paper were studying something called coral bleaching. It's something that's happening in response to climate change. Corals are colonies of tiny animals, and each animal has in its cells symbiotic algae. The algae harvest energy from light to do photosynthesis, and they share some of the resulting sugars with the coral animal. Coral bleaching happens when the ocean gets too hot. The algae leave the corals, and because the algae are kind of brownish, without the algae, the corals look pure white. That's why they call it bleaching. People had noticed that sometimes after the corals turned white, some of them would turn brilliant colors by producing colorful, sometimes even fluorescent proteins. But no one knew why the corals did this. The scientists considered two hypotheses for why the corals make those colorful pigments. On the one hand, maybe the corals are responding to the same thing that caused the algae to leave the cells, too much heat. On the other hand, maybe the corals are responding to too much light. Because remember that those algae are brown, and they help protect the cells from too much sunlight because they absorb sunlight to do photosynthesis. So without the algae, the corals are more exposed to sunlight. And maybe just like we get browner when we get tan, maybe the corals are making those pigments to protect themselves from too much light. To test that hypothesis, the scientists took corals in the lab and they induced coral bleaching in a number of ways that didn't involve heat. That way they could rule out the heat hypothesis. And what they saw is that even without heat, after the corals were bleached, they produced the colorful pigments. But they only did it when they were exposed to the most damaging wavelengths of light, suggesting that corals can sense how much light they're exposed to. And when they don't have their algae to protect them, they produce pigments to protect themselves instead. If a heat wave lasts a long time, then the bleached corals can die. But if it's a short heat wave, after the temperature lowers, the algae can recolonize the corals. And what they show in this paper is that the corals that made the colorful proteins were more likely to be recolonized by the algae. Coral bleaching is not cool. It's killing corals all over the world because of climate change. But getting a bright purple tan is pretty cool. And learning more about colorful coral bleaching may help us be able to better protect corals in the future.